Hi guys, so I received a few replies back on a comment that I left on one of Adrian Black's videos about one of these kind of Scart HDMI scalers. And I kind of wanted to give my input, my experience with these, and how I kind of tweak them for the environments that I use them in. So mainly I use these in kind of a Pro AV world, as these are really a great Swiss Army knife video converter for any person dealing in Pro AV. So as you can see here, they have both a Scart input and HDMI input. And over Scart, in the NTSC domain, it gives us the option for component input, and then in the kind of PAL region, it gives us the option for RGB. However, both RGB and component work in both PAL inputs and NTSC style inputs on the specific adapter. In addition, it also gives us an HDMI input that supports everything down to 240p, computer resolutions like 800 by 600, all the way up to 1080p 30. And on the output side here, we're given an HDMI output which has no HDCP encryption, which is really useful. And kind of one of my primary uses for this device is being able to remove HDCP encryption and extract audio at the same time for older projectors, or bringing kind of a Blu-ray player into a video switcher that doesn't support HDCP, that kind of scenario. And like I mentioned, the audio, so you have normal analog audio output and coaxial audio output, which is nice. One downside of that output is that I haven't been able to see or get 5.1 audio to come out of it. I didn't try extensively, but it's just something to keep in mind if that might be something that you're looking to use it for. Then to the right of that's the buttons where you have input selection, output resolution selection, and output frame rate selection. So like I said, my use case for these is more so in the Pro AV world than it is kind of for retro scaling. And what I tend to use them with is actually these Majorwell capture cards. So what's nice about these particular capture cards and other brands of a similar device is that they're UVC, or Universal Video Codec, which means you don't need a driver to use them with most operating systems. It's really just plug and play, shows up like a webcam. But one major downside of these devices, especially HDMI-based versions, is that if there's any kind of hiccup in the incoming video signal, or your device decides to change resolution, say an Xbox booting or something like that, where it's going to change from 480p to 1080p, the device will actually drop out and show up as a new device with a new resolution. And software like Wirecast or OBS really doesn't deal with that very well. So by going through one of these, because this is a TV scaler chip basically, is instead of dropping the HDMI output, it'll just show a no signal message like you would see on a normal TV, instead of like an LCD going black. And so that really helps out in the Pro AV world, is no matter what happens on the input side of the switcher, you always know the output's going to be a rock solid 720p or 1080p or 1080i output. So after opening one of these up and seeing it had an Mstar based basically TV scaler chip inside of it, I started looking into how the USB debugging on these works, as briefly messing around with kind of TVs and learning that a lot of TV-based scaler boards need to be programmed for individual LCDs, and that these chips are pretty universal for what LCDs they can actually drive, is that there has to be kind of an end-user / TV repairman accessible tool to be able to set these chips up, basically, and tell them what they're attached to. So by looking on Alibaba and things, I saw adapters like this, which it looks just basically like an FTDI chip. And so that got me thinking that, hey, there must be a UART inside one of these. So sure enough, broke it open, and it's just normal UART pins. Generally, the ones you'll see on places like Alibaba are actually going to be, they're actually going to have a VGA connector on the end. And that actually confused me for a while as to why they'd have a USB to UART adapter with a VGA plug. But what I came to find out is actually in a lot of Mstar-based TVs and scaler boards, they actually wire up the UART pins to the ID pins on the VGA connector, which allows a TV technician to be able to reprogram the chip or view diagnostic data from outside the TV. If, for example, here's one right here. That's a really good piece of info to have in mind, is that I found out that wasn't actually unique to Mstar, is most TV manufacturers will either use a 3.5mm jack or the ID pins on a VGA port to be able to break out a UART on those ID pins. And so, if you're ever into hacking TVs or whatnot, that's kind of the best place to start. So moving on from that, I saw a lot of these AliExpress listings had versions of the software that came with this tool. So for example, here's the Mstar TV system tool used for reprogramming and changing kind of the internal settings on one of these chips. However, this software is really hard to find on the internet. As far as I can tell, other than the people shipping them on CDs with these reprogramming devices, there's really not a way to get any of these newer versions of the software. Unfortunately, I was able to find a version of the software, but it was extremely outdated and doesn't actually fully support the chip, the scalar IC that's inside of these Scart adapters. It does work, but with limited functionality. So moving on to the software itself here, I have an older version, it's version 4.092. This doesn't properly support all the features of the scalar chip inside of one of these adapters. However, it's enough to get the job done. So when you first open up the software here, it'll ask you for a COM port. Simply select your UART adapter. These particular scalar boards run at 115200, no parity, 8 bits, and 1 stop bit. And the no flow control, obviously, as it's a UART. I would recommend unchecking auto reconnect, as sometimes this software can get a little carried away when you lose a connection and try multiple thousands of serial port reconnects per second and can actually lock up your computer, which is not a fun experience. The chip select for this specific board is the 6000 series. It's the closest that I could find to the actual chip on the board, but it doesn't quite match up properly, and I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So these values here, by selecting them, what it'll do is down here in this spreadsheet looking area, it'll actually pull up the values for these different menu items basically from the firmware. So here, example OSD, actually the first couple bits are actually the color of the on-screen display as well as transparencies and things like that. PWM has to do with if there's a backlight driver in the PWM frequencies of that, as well as all sorts of other fun goodness inside of here. Again, most of it doesn't apply to the chip that we have, but for things like 3D noise canceling and upsampling for a composite, you can actually see the values in here changing as a composite input changes, which is interesting. So again, here's more values you can pull in from the actual DSP of the chip. Most of these I wasn't able to get to work. I assume it has to do with an older version of the chip or a chip with different inputs or something like that, and I don't think these datas line up properly. So the video decoder, again, more bits. You'd really have to have an exact manual of the chip to know what each of these registers does. EEPROM actually will read the entire I2C EEPROM attached to it, which is really helpful. I did a bin dump as well from a programmer, and it actually matched up bit for bit. So this is great for reprogramming if anyone does manage to reverse engineer the firmware on these things, as well as reading everything. You can't seem to actually write to anything in here. I don't know if that's intentional based on how the software works, or if you're supposed to be able to manipulate values and it's just not properly supported in this because of the incompatibility between this older version of the software and the newer IC. I'm not quite sure. So this view menu here opens all sorts of fun things. So for example, Osd Adjustment actually lets you adjust things like the here's H scaling and V scaling. Now I believe this actually has to do with older composite-based chips meant for things like CRTs, as the bits that this is writing to don't seem to do anything, and can tend to actually lock up the scalar chip, which is interesting. One other interesting menu is the scalar adjustment. So this is most likely what the settings that we would want to tweak, or the retro community would want to tweak to make this kind of the most usable device and best quality. I have been able to change, some things here. For example, like the panel width when we're set to 1280 by 720. Changing this to something like 640 by 480 will actually make a pixel-perfect scale down of an input signal at 640 by 480 in the middle of the screen. So some of these values do actually affect the output of the scalar. However, most of them don't seem to actually function properly. Moving on to the direct command mode. So this is the most interesting portion of the software by far. This actually emulates IR commands from a remote control to the projectors. As you can see, as I hover over buttons here, it'll show the different kind of hexadecimal values relating to each of these buttons. Now, one word of caution: if you do press any button on this remote without a UART properly connected to one of these scalar chips, it will crash the entire software package. So word of caution. So by using these, there's buttons such as power, I believe is this button here, as well as input is this button here. So you can kind of think of it as actually laid out as kind of a cheap Chinese generic remote control. So kind of by futzing through these, you can figure out which button does what. One of them will actually open a full-on TV OSD menu where you can change things like aspect ratio, color, contrast, as well as being able to change inputs to inputs that weren't previously available. For example, if you select the component inputs instead of RGB, if you feed component into the Scart connector, it will actually properly scale it and output it over HDMI, which previously wasn't a feature I was able to get to work without manually selecting a component input using these virtual remote buttons. If one were so inclined, you can actually just have a PuTTY window open at the same time as you press these buttons, and you can just see the commands it's sending over UART to the scaler, and you could program those into microcontroller or script on your computer or whatnot to be able to send these commands directly to this box. Actually, what's interesting is these buttons on the front of the unit are actually hooked up through a small Atmel microcontroller right to the exact same UART pins. So that's exactly how whoever designed this box is controlling the scaler chip, is the same way that the software does, just by sending button press commands directly into the chip. I can't seem to find a way to turn off that ugly UI overlay. You can set the transparency to like 80-ish% in the on-screen menu, if I remember properly, just to make it a bit less intrusive. But other than that, there's not many options in here. One nice feature about this tool is, as you can see right now, these are all set to underlines. Once you realize what buttons do what, you can come in here and actually label them, which makes futzing with one of these a lot easier in the future. And because it's a TV scaler chip, any settings you make to contrast or default video input or things like that will actually stick around and remain upon power off and everything. Another feature of this chip, once you start futzing around with it, is you realize that there's a USB input option, and if you solder headers onto the unused USB pads on the circuit board and hook up something like a flash drive with MP4 files and bitmaps on it, you can actually use this as a built-in media player. It can actually play the files right off of a FAT32 formatted USB stick, which I thought was an interesting omission from the circuit board. Just by soldering on a header, they could easily have added some more features to this. So I personally really like these boards, as they're quite hackable. Like I said, I've made a few that have a small Arduino inside with a few buttons that I've drilled into the top to do things like set to those non-standard video inputs or change aspect ratio just by sending button press combinations. And so if anyone has a lead on, like I said, on one of these newer Mstar system tools, that would really be great, as it would help I think the whole community kind of be able to fully embrace the power of these little Mstar scaler chips. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you have any additional info or know where we might be able to acquire newer versions of this, or if you have possibly a manual of this IC and what registers here actually control what, and that would be great.